All right, hi everybody. Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you all for watching. In this video, I'm going to take some time to conclude Plato's Meno. So this will be the last part in our study of the Meno. Um, so hopefully these shorter videos are helping. They're helping with being more bite-sized for getting a good understanding of what's going on in the text. So, but if there are any issues with understanding anything that I say, don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know how I can try to clarify. So let me share my screen with you. So we have a new question. So we're moving beyond the slave example. We're good with all that, I hope. And now we have this new question, which is virtue teachable? So in a way, we're going back and to the beginning of the dialogue where um, Meno launches off with the question, is virtue teachable? And Socrates is like, well, I don't know what virtue is, and then they're off to the races figuring that out. Um, So that's the beginning of the dialogue. I like to carve things up. I like to divide the Meno into three parts. So the first part is the discussion of virtue, the nature of virtue, whether it can, whether we can offer that essence of virtue that Socrates is looking for. And then the middle part is, Meno being upset with Socrates and then running Meno's paradox and then Socrates' response to Meno on that front that culminates in the slave example. And then the third part, the later part, so early, middle, and late here, and the later part kicks off with this Socrates taking up this new question. Meno is urging Socrates to take it up. And I'm going to be a little quick here because I want to get to this famous Larissa example from page 89 of the text. So the question is virtue teachable? And we're going to ultimately end up with the answer that it's not teachable. And this is because virtue is not a kind of knowledge, as it turns out. Um, so what Socrates says in response to Meno is urging him to take up the topic of discussion whether virtue is teachable is, well, give me this hypothesis method. Give me this hypothesis that virtue is knowledge, because if virtue is knowledge, then it's teachable. Um, and as I said, they're going to end up agreeing that virtue is not teachable, so it's not a kind of knowledge, which is interesting because you would think that virtue is teachable given that we're not innately virtuous. So I think the slogan we're working with here, something to keep in mind, again, I'm going to repeat it. The slogan we're working with here is we are, or a virtue in its entirety is an achievement because we're not born virtuous. So if it's not teachable, then how are people like Pericles? How are people who are virtuous in the first place? That would need some explanation. We're going to see where this leads by the end of the text, but we know the answer to end up being no. But still, Socrates ends up initially saying that it is, and he gives an argument for it being teachable because virtue is knowledge. So just very briefly, this hypothesis method is supposed to be connected to the method those who do geometry use, the geometers use um, as Socrates describes them in the text. So we begin with an hypothesis, and then in a way we kind of confirm the hypothesis. We try to prove the hypothesis, and then we take the hypothesis and link it to this this implication of it, namely that is in this case that is teachable. So the next step is to determine whether virtue is knowledge. Okay, the text is not the clearest here, but um, we go back a bunch of pages here just to show you like where the conversation begins. Yeah, so it's page 79. You know, given my hypothesis method here, and then the method, the hypothesis gets discussed here. Virtue is a kind of knowledge. So I'm just simplifying, saying that virtue is knowledge. We don't have to make the distinction, um, about the virtue being a kind of knowledge, namely, wisdom or something like that. So that's a simplification. I hope you'll grant, just so I don't have to keep saying a kind of knowledge and then leave you like wondering what this kind of knowledge is. So let's just initially just presuppose that the hypothesis is that virtue is knowledge. If we need to, delve deeper and explore further what this kind of knowledge is, we can definitely do that. So that's where this happens, and there's just sort of a lengthy discussion until we again we get to page 89, where we're gonna end up focusing where we get this Larissa example. Um, so we'll get there. I want to kind of move quickly through these slides here. So hopefully we're clear on what's going on here. Admittedly, it's not the clearest thing that we get this kind of back and forth. We know the answers end up being no, but the first answer is yes. How is the answer yes? Well, first of all, what is true about virtue? Um, and then is it that also true of knowledge? If that's the case, then we have reason to think that virtue is knowledge. Okay. And the relevant sense of is here, I promise this is not just a throwaway point. The relevant sense of is here is the is of identity. So we say that virtue is virtue knowledge. We're asking, is virtue identical to knowledge? Like, are they the same thing with just different names? Much like we might say water and H2O are the same thing, but they're just different names for that same thing. So um, so there's another sense of is that we often use, right? We use is to predicate, usually a property to some object. So we say snow is white, grass is green, to give easy examples, or Superman is very awesome, something like that. Think of your own favorite examples there, but we use is to predicate properties without maintaining identity. But we also use is to identify, don't we? So we say water is H2O. We say Superman is Clark Kent. We say um, other such things. Okay. So here it's the is of identity that matters here as we disambiguate the meaning of this English word is. Okay. So yes, it is. So again, I told you what the strategy was. This virtue is it's the intrinsic good. Okay, meaning it is the one essential good. It's the one thing that is good by its very nature, meaning it's the one thing that doesn't derive its goodness from anything else. It just has it, and it's ultimately going to explain why anything else counts as good. So when we think about goodness, when we reflect on goodness, we quickly think that there's a difference between things that are good by their very nature, and there's things that are good because they're related to those to these special kinds of goods. So what one is saying here on the slide is that virtue is that one thing, that special good that explains why other things are good. So if our example is wealth, success, um, um, beauty, justice, or courage, right? What explains why those things are good? Well, because they bring about virtue, okay? Um, or they're good when they bring about virtue, because they could also be used for bad, okay? So so given that there are these set of good things that could also be bad, um, what explains when they're good? Well, it's the intrinsically good things, and virtue is the one thing, okay, that's intrinsically good. Obviously, a debatable point. We're trying to understand the argument here, or just want to give you this a sketch of it. Well, knowledge, Socrates argues, is also intrinsically good. And we know that by thinking about, Socrates says, by claiming that by when we examine various goods, some of which I just mentioned, bodily goods and soul goods, health, wealth, and beauty, bodily goods, um, courage, moderation, munificence, quick-mindedness, these kinds of things as soul goods, mind goods, if you will. Um, well, they're good, but they can also be bad. What explains when they're good is um, when they are um, properly understood, properly known, something like this. There's something about how when they're properly used, they're good, and the proper use involves knowledge at its core. So knowledge is something that is ultimately going to explain when uh, these other bodily goods and soul goods count as good. Um, so knowledge is intrinsically good. So then virtue just has to be knowledge in terms of it's identical to knowledge. They're just different names for the same thing. And remember our golden assumption: if virtue is knowledge and is teachable, because knowledge is the kind of thing that can be taught, well then virtue is teachable. Yeah, if virtue and knowledge as the example is holding you up a little bit and is a sticking point, think of a different kind of example. Suppose I say, and you could use your own superhero if you want. Suppose I say that Superman is the superhero. Suppose like we're imagining a universe in which there's only one superhero, and it's Superman. Okay, not a bad choice, right? Some of you might not like it. Choose your own. So, I say Superman is the superhero, and then I say that Clark Kent is a superhero. Then don't they have to be the same? They're just different names for the same person. Or consider this other scientific type example. If I say, um, water is the substance that fills our oceans, rivers, and lakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I say that H2O is what fills is something that fills our oceans, rivers, lakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But don't water and H2O have to be the same thing, just different names for the same thing? It would seem like it. And then we could run, right, many, many more examples using the same logic. So virtue is knowledge, but virtue is teachable. Now, we know Socrates is end up rejecting this argument because he then says, I want to doubt the hypothesis that virtue is knowledge, and we won't be able to conclude that virtue is teachable. In fact, we'll be able to conclude that virtue is not teachable. Right? And now we're in trouble, right? Because how do we explain how Pericles is virtuous, or anyone who's virtuous is virtuous? Because they're not born virtuous, they're not taught it, but they're virtuous. So we have a huge question mark plaguing us. So what's the long and short of this argument? It's not a very good argument, as it turns out, and perhaps the previous argument wasn't very good as well. But this one, has some low-hanging fruit that you likely gathered when you're reading it, and hopefully you read it carefully. If you haven't, I really recommend that you do so. Um, so the argument sketch is really, look, Socrates gets Meno to accept that virtue is knowledge only if it's teachable. Okay. So, and then gets him to accept that virtue is teachable only if they're teachers of virtue. So we get this, this like necessary condition for something counting as knowledge is that it's teachable. Something necessary condition for something being teachable is that they're teachers of virtue. So we can then claim that, well, virtue is knowledge only if they're teachers of virtue. Okay. This is some variation of a logical rule, which is perfectly valid. So the move from 1 to 2 to 3 is perfectly valid. Okay. So P only if Q, Q only if R, so P only if R. Okay. So I recommend that you maybe write that down and give it other examples. So again, P only if Q, and Q only if R, so P only if R. Okay. Um, so here might be like another like philosophical example that'd be helpful. So um, um, I'm morally responsible only if I'm free. I'm free only if I could have done otherwise. So I'm morally responsible only if I could have done otherwise. And again, pause the video and write that down and have a look at it and see the logical flow of it. It's just another example of, P only if Q, Q only if R, and then P. Then what follows, the inference that we're making is if P only if R. Okay, so it's the same form that's used here, and we could multiply examples. I've given you another example involving being morally responsible, requiring being free requiring being able to do otherwise, and then it follows, doesn't it, that being morally responsible requires being able to do otherwise. Okay. I recommend watching this maybe a couple times until it sinks in, because that's how we get to 3. But then Socrates does this empirical work in the text. You likely gathered this, where he tried to determine whether any teachers of virtue. He has a conversation with Anytus, who's a statesman in Athens who's hosting Meno, as you likely know. And Anytus, as we know from other texts, it's according to Plato's works, this also an accuser, a criminal accuser of Socrates. So he's like Meletus was in the Euthyphro. Um, but Anytus says that um, that the candidate that Socrates brings up for counting as teacher of virtue doesn't count as Socrates. Okay, I agree with you on that. They're sophists. Who are the sophists? The sophists are these teachers of rhetoric in ancient Greece and the ancient Greek city-states. Um, so sophists aren't teachers of virtue, as one probability. But what about the virtuous themselves? Um, um, so Leonidas seems to suggest that, well, the virtuous Athenian gentlemen, they're virtuous and they're teachers of virtue. But then Socrates goes on to say, but if they're teachers of virtue, then surely their sons or their children, more generally, let's hope, would be virtuous, but they're not, so they're not teachers of virtue. So Pericles, as our paradigmatic example, is someone who's virtuous in ancient Athens, isn't a teacher of virtue, even though he himself is virtuous. And that gives Socrates some empirical support. He thinks for the idea that um, that that there are no teachers of virtue. So sophists aren't, and the virtuous themselves aren't teachers of virtue. So there's no one who's virtuous, it seems. So given that there's no teachers of virtue, then virtue is not knowledge, and virtue is not teachable. So that's the logic there. And I mean, the logic might be okay. It's just that the empirical work is problematic. Um, there might be some problems with the logic of two, but I'll set that aside. There's lower hanging fruit. If you think about two and what might be problematic with it, send me a message. I'd be happy to chat with you about that, or come to office hours. We can chat about it there. But the empirical work that Socrates does there is pretty shoddy. Okay, you need more empirical support for the idea that there are no teachers of virtue. Maybe he's making the assumption that, well, Athens is no different from everywhere else in the world. If I can show that in Athens, arbitrarily, randomly selected, that the virtuous aren't teachers of virtue, um, then it looks like we're running real low on teachers of virtue. Maybe there just aren't any. Maybe something like that's going on. We're not giving that in the text, but if we could strengthen his argument, but it still might not be good enough. So might just say that there's an empirical problem with Socrates' fourth premise in this argument, because he'd have to examine the world much more before he's in a position to say that there are no teachers of virtue. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. But no worries, because even if this argument fails, Socrates is like, well, I've got another argument. Excuse me. That argument involves that counterexample strategy, or the example strategy that we find on page 89, the Larissa example. So the question, remember, that we're dealing with here is virtue knowledge. We want to know that, because if it is knowledge, well, then it's teachable. If it's not knowledge, we have reason to deny its teachability. Excuse me. And then if the answer ends up being that virtue isn't knowledge and it's not teachable, then what explains how virtuous people are virtuous? That becomes a very big question, a very pressing question. So the theory that Socrates is considering is the theory that virtue is knowledge. Again, is identical. Virtue just is identical to knowledge. They're different names for the same reality. And the Larissa example is what we call a counterexample. This is a strategy that Plato uses all through his works, and it's a strategy that we still use to this day. So this is a nice legacy point from Plato's Meno. Like, here's a strategy for dealing with theories: is see whether the theory can explain some attempt at countering it. So the relevant theory here would be his virtue. That virtue is knowledge, and then that theory seems like it's undercut by the example that's provided. Okay, it seems like the theory can't account for the example that's provided. So how does it work here? Well, there'll be cases where someone has virtue without the relevant knowledge. Okay, so virtue without knowledge would establish that virtue isn't knowledge, wouldn't it? Because anywhere there's virtue, there also has to be knowledge if they're the same thing. Everywhere there's Superman, there has to be Clark Kent. Everywhere there's water, there has to be H2O. So if you could show, you know, um, if you could show that here's an instance of water that's not H2O, then water's not H2O. Now you can't do that, presumably. But if you could, then you'd have a counterexample. Okay. All right. So that's how the counterexample is supposed to work. And Socrates is like, okay, let me give you a clear case of virtue. Knowledge isn't present, so virtue isn't knowledge. How does the example work? So let's go to the text here, page 89. So it says, so I'll tell you, a man who knew the way to Larissa or anywhere else you like and went there and directed others would surely lead them well and correctly. Certainly. So here we have virtue with knowledge. Okay, so that's not going to be the counterexample, right? So this confirms the theory that virtue is knowledge, because this man, he knew the way to Larissa, and then he gave directions. He got himself there, but gave directions and succeeded in getting someone there. So was virtuous in that regard. So we have virtue, a kind of practical success. There's other kinds of virtue. There's theoretical success. There's other kinds of different kinds of practical success. There's like a moral sense of virtue, but then there's also this practical sense, and it's or this non-moral practical sense, I should say, that that Socrates lands on for his example. So when we're thinking about virtue, we need to be thinking about moral virtue. We're just thinking about, you might say, a kind of excellence, the excellent use of our rational faculties or capacities or something like that. And that can occur in a practical way, which could be either moral or non-moral, as the non-moral case is here, someone giving directions, and then a theoretical case where we're concerned with being virtuous with respect to coming to understand our world around us or something like that. So the reason why I divide the kinds of virtue in terms of the practical and the theoretical is because they correspond to two general, very general ways in which we can be virtuous, or excellent in our lives. We can be virtuous with respect to how well we act and how well we think. Okay, so acting and thinking are just two central things, right, that are so important in our lives. And so virtue, being virtuous, applies to those and to these two domains. There's presumably a way in which they're related as well, but we can set that aside. All I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say that the example here that Socrates gives us through Plato is an example of practical success, which counts as a kind of virtue, and it's a non-moral kind of practical success. Okay, it doesn't involve something like, giving to charity, helping the needy, or anything like that. That's, paradigmatic example of the things that would count as acting morally correctly. It has to involve giving directions, which in and of itself isn't a moral thing. Okay, at least at first blush, it's not. Okay, and so given that there's these different ways that we think about virtue, if virtue is knowledge, then each of these cases, or each of these kinds of virtue, they'd all have to amount to knowledge. So all Socrates needs, all Plato needs, is a case of practical success, or kind of a case where we have virtue, a kind of excellence, where there's no knowledge, whether it's practical or theoretical. He just uses a practical, non-moral kind. Okay. So, and then we have, in this case, an example of someone who knows and they're virtuous. And that confirms the theory as far as it goes. But it's the next part of the example that disconfirms the theory. And he says this, what if someone had a correct opinion as to which was the way, but had not gone there, nor indeed had knowledge of it? Would he not also lead correctly? So he has to imagine someone who doesn't have knowledge of how to get to Larissa, but still is able to get himself there or provide directions to another successfully. Here, the practical success is a practical excellence, which counts as a virtue, according to Socrates. But then there's no knowledge in the case. There's only a correct opinion, or what we might say, a mere true belief. Okay. So you might be wondering, like, what's the difference between knowing something and having a true belief about something? Well, it would seem as if one can have true beliefs without knowledge, right? So I can truly believe that I'm going to win the lottery. Let's suppose I can just get into a state where I actually believe I'm going to win the lottery, and then I win. Okay, that'd be awesome, of course. But supposing I win, I have a true belief, but we wouldn't say that I knew, right? Intuitively. So we think about the case where it looks like true belief or mere true belief doesn't count as knowledge. We think that knowledge, whatever it is, it requires true belief, but you also need to add something else to it to get to knowledge. And what's lacking in the lottery case that I just gave would be something like evidence or justification or the reason why I believe the thing in question. Okay, so Hopefully that's somewhat helpful when thinking about the difference between correct opinion, true opinion, and knowledge. These are different things. Whatever knowledge is, it involves having a belief. Like imagine, someone were to say to you, "I know that 2 + 2 = 4, but I don't believe it." You wonder whether they understood what it means to know something. Okay. Moreover, suppose someone said that they had a belief, they believe that 2 + 2 = 5. Well, in that case, they'd have a false belief. Okay, because 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, so that's help us understand like what's meant by a true belief. A true belief is a thought that someone has, this is an attitude that someone takes towards some idea like 2 + 2 = 4, right? And it's true when that that belief corresponds to the way the world is. Okay, so there's a relationship between like our thoughts, right, that are presumably in our brains, in our heads, in our minds, in our souls, whatever, like in our attempt to represent the way the world is. And there's then also the way the world is. And when you have the right match between the two, we have truth. Okay. That's what a true belief can be. But you can have cases where you have the true belief without having the knowledge because perhaps you don't have the um, uh, sufficient evidence, right? Or sufficient justification or sufficient reason for the belief that you have, like in the lottery example. Okay. So in this case, we're supposed to imagine someone who has a mere true belief, but not knowledge, but has virtue. So then virtue is not knowledge. Okay. Okay. So that's the counterexample structure. That's what the Lewis example is supposed to show. And then, so then now you have an answer to the question, is virtue knowledge? Well, it's not. But there we go. Um, so hopefully that makes sense and hopefully that's clear. Now, we're not giving a lot of details in the case. So let me see if I can give sort of a class version of the case to help out. And I want to kind of set aside the lottery case. That's just to initially get you to think about the difference between true belief and knowledge. Um, it's tricky because it's very difficult to imagine someone coming to a state of mind where they believe they're going to win the lottery, given what seems to be required for believing something. But set that aside and suppose that is possible. It may well be. It's just hard to sometimes imagine how that could be. And think about the second Larissa example. So, I mean, the Larissa example, let's just let it involve, the case of knowledge, but then the case of lack of knowledge, the case of just a mere true belief. But in both cases, there's virtue. So we end up concluding that virtue isn't knowledge. Um, but let's see if we can develop a past version of the case, and it might go like this. Um, you know, there you are, and you're trying to get to Larissa, and you run across this man who has um, who you're approaching, and hey, like, can you help me get to Larissa? I don't know how to get there myself. I'm trying to find it and having no luck. And this person says to you, he says, "Gosh, it's been a long time since I've been there, or it's been a long time since my parents taught me how to get there." So they're scratching their head and they're racking their memory. And it's like, my memory's fuzzy, but um, if you go blah blah blah, and they start giving the directions, and then it turns out you get there. So you follow the directions that this person gave you based on a kind of fuzzy memory, of course, a little bit of luck, and the person succeeded in getting you there. The person had a mere true belief, we'd say, because the person had a true belief on how to get you there because they gave you the right directions. We wouldn't want to say, at least intuitively, that this would be a case of knowledge because the practical success doesn't count as knowledge. It's more that the person's fuzzy memory suggests that there's some like justification or some evidence the person has for the belief that he has on how to get to Larissa, and that gives you directions there. I mean, given the faultiness of the memory, we might say something like, well, yeah, some justification, some evidence, but not enough to where we say the person had knowledge. So presumably the person who has knowledge, we're going to say has, a reliable memory. Like their memory isn't fuzzy. It's clear enough to where they would go, oh yeah, like that person had knowledge because like they say, okay, I was there just the other day. You go left here, right there, and all the rest. And they give you the directions, and you get there. When the person doesn't have knowledge, they have a mere true belief, right? It's not just a pure yes. Let's say it's partial guess, but it's just like it's relying on a fuzzy memory, right? Which we do all the time, but that's the case where we wouldn't want to say that we knew. So that might be a way of thinking about the Larissa example, where the person has a mere true belief but not knowledge. Is there's just faulty, as we call it, justification or faulty evidence in the sense that we don't have sufficient evidence to warrant saying that we have knowledge. So when we think about what it means to have enough evidence or what it means to have justification, we think about things like, sense experience, using our five senses to come to gather evidence for the beliefs that we have. We think about memory, as just mentioned. We think about testimony. We think about the things that reliable people tell us about the world. So your professors, hopefully, um, your history professors, your astronomy professors, your geology professors, hopefully your philosophy professors, as reliable um, witnesses, as reliable experts in their areas of study, you know, can serve as sources of justification. There's also reasoning. We reason our way to truth. We use valid forms of inference, right? We move from you know premise to premise in a very careful, logical way, in a way that preserves truth as best we can. We make inductive inferences, meaning that we argue from what premise to a conclusion on the basis of probability. We say, gosh, every emerald that I've studied so far is been green and has thus and such property. So they all do, even though we know that it's not impossible that there be some emerald or other that doesn't have those properties. It's just that's the nature of inductive inferences. It's a probabilistic inference that we make. Right, different from the kinds of inferences that we made here when we move from 1 to 2 to 3, or even from 3 to 4, where we can know that our conclusions follow because we're following valid logical forms. But there's also probabilistic logic forms. Right? That's largely the way in which we do quite a bit of science. Okay, there's more that I could say here, but there's ways of thinking about the Larissa example whereby we understand what it means to have a mere true belief, um, but still the practical success. And what does that involve? That involves thinking about some faulty, some faultiness in the justification in the case. So, I use memory, but you could also use sense experience. Like, you're looking and it's foggy out, and so your senses are compromised. Your sense experience is compromised, but you can kind of see where you think Larissa is over there. You see some lights, you see some landmarks that or things that look like landmarks. Given the fogginess, you're not quite sure, but you sort of follow what appears to your senses to be the case, and you get there. You wouldn't want to say that you knew in that case, given how your senses were compromised by the fogginess, or you weren't wearing your glasses, or something like that. But still, um, there was a practical success there. Now, you might be then wondering, is this even if we doctor up or add to or tweak Socrates' example so it's a bit more understandable, you still might wonder whether the counterexample is a good one. I think there's room to press against Socrates here. There's room to challenge him. So we want to say, here's a clear case of virtue, um, where we don't have knowledge, we just have mere true belief or mere correct opinion, as he puts it. So then virtue is not knowledge. But remember, in order for this counterexample to work, we need a clear case of virtue. And this is again a non-moral form of practical virtue. Practical success is counting as a kind of virtue for Socrates. Would we want to say that this is a clear case of virtue? And that's what we need for the counterexample to work. Clear case of virtue where there's mere true belief and not knowledge, so virtue is not knowledge. Okay. Now think about just practical success. When we want to say that someone is virtuous in their practical success, um, do we typically think that? Um, we can know whether someone's practically that someone's virtuous with their practical success, um, based on um, one um, one moment of success, one moment of practical success. So think about, like, you're watching like um, an archer, and you see them shoot one arrow, and they are near the target. Maybe they hit the bullseye, something like that. From that case, would you be able to determine that that person was virtuous with respect to the practical activity that they're engaged in? Yeah. Or, you see someone shooting a free throw, and they swish it. It's the only one, it's the only shot that you see them shoot. Um, would you say in that case that that instance of practical success, that one instance, counts as being virtuous? And would you know that they're virtuous in that kind of case? What if someone is like, you see someone practically succeed in um, in you know crocheting a row in a blanket? Would that one instance tell you that that person was a virtuous crocheter? If we could multiply examples here, I'm just trying to give a few different kinds of examples here. And ask yourself, you can pause the video here and ask yourself, in those cases, would we think that we have virtue? I think the answer is no, right? And it seems quite clear that, in order to know whether or not, for example, I'm a virtuous free throw shooter, you'd have to, see me shoot many free throws, you know, and you'd learn that I'm not a virtuous free throw shooter. I might make, you know, s- when I'm practicing regularly, I might be able to make, regularly 6 or 7 out of 10. Um, but um, that doesn't make me a virtuous one. Um, But Steph Curry, let's take him. Like, he's a great, great shooter. It's like many of you likely know. He's the virtuous free throw shooter. Um, how do we know that? Because we've seen him repeatedly make free throws. So, and maybe the better example is 3 pointers, where I might make like 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10 on a good day. Um, I mean, that guy is money, especially like probably in practice. Virtuous, but how do we know that? Because we've seen him shoot and make a lot of 3 pointers. Likewise, the Olympian archer, right? We've seen him, right, over and over again, practically succeed. So Socrates has given us a case where someone has practically succeeded once. That doesn't tell us anything about this, whether or not this person is virtuous. It's it gets us, like an initial, empirical example, but we need many more before we'd be willing to say that person's virtuous, right? So the example doesn't seem to work. Mm. And it might turn out, just to round things out here, it might turn out that, at least in many cases of practical success, when we end up answering, like the question, what explains how that practical success even counts, excuse me, as a kind of virtue? You might say it's because the person knows what they're doing. And so we haven't then, um, um, in that way of thinking about things, shown that virtue isn't knowledge. Okay. So then Meno's question at this point is, well, if being virtue is consistent with both knowledge and mere true belief, why is knowledge considered more valuable than true belief? Now we know that that if part could end up being wrong. Okay, let's just run with Meno's question here, because we've challenged Socrates and Meno on this point. But supposing the if part, the supposition, but suppose it. Why is knowledge considered more valuable than mere true belief, as we're putting it in the text? It's why is knowledge considered more valuable than correct opinion? And Socrates' response is, if there are daily lists of statues. So Meno's questions here. The last Meno passage on page 89. Socrates says, I'll tell you why you wonder that, why you wonder whether, why you wonder why you wonder, why we value knowledge over right opinion or mere true belief. And then Socrates says, very at the bottom of the page, is because you paid no attention to the statutes of Daedalus, perhaps are not at Thessaly, and then, wants to know what he means by that. And like, long story short, it's going to be, well, um, true beliefs, mere true beliefs, are like Daedalus' statues, in that Daedalus' statues are prone to float away. Right? There's these beautiful statues that Daedalus creates, but they're prone to fly away. But if they fly away, then presumably their value is less than when they could be kept tied down. Socrates says they too run away and escape if one does not tie them down, but remain in place if tied down. He continues, to acquire an untied work of Daedalus is not worth much, like acquiring a runaway slave, for it does not remain, but it is worth much if tied down, for his works are very beautiful. What am I thinking of when I say this? True opinions, or as we're calling them, mere true beliefs. For true opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine thing, and all they do is good. But they're not willing to remain long, and they escape from a man's mind, so that they are not worth much until one ties them down by giving an account of the reason why. So there's, this cool imagery. We're supposed to connect this image of Daedalus' statues not being tied down with mere true beliefs. Mere true beliefs, they fly away. But of course, this is all metaphorical language. What non-metaphorical language might we be able to appeal to explain what's going on here? And it's that a mere true belief, um, given that it's not properly quote unquote tied down, right? Um, 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 it's a kind of belief that that you might well have, but it also might be a belief that you don't have. Just like Daedalus' statue, you might have it, but then since it floats away, you might not have it. You might very well not have it. Meaning that when you have a mere true belief, you could have very easily have believed something else, and that something else would have been false. I mean, think about it. Like, when we have a true belief, our mind captures the way the world is, and there's only one way that can happen. There's only one way to be right, but there are so many ways of going wrong. So if you don't have that true belief, you have a false belief. So you could have had a false belief. So in as much as you have the true belief, that's great. But if it's a mere true belief, it's not tied down, quote unquote, then that means that you could have had another belief which would have been false. Very easily could have had that another belief which could have been false. And then if we tie down the true belief, then that's a more valuable thing, and that's what knowledge is. So you take the mere true belief, you tie it down with knowledge. There's no longer a mere true belief. So you tie it down in some way, and that gets you knowledge. Excuse me. So you no longer have a mere true belief. Now, what does that amount to? He says that it's because the reason why. It's the reason why the belief is true. In other words, it's the justification or the rationale or the support for it, the evidence for the belief being true. That ties down the belief. And when you have evidence for your belief, let's say sufficient evidence for your belief, it keeps the belief in place, doesn't it? Suppose the belief is true, it keeps that true belief in place, okay? Because you have evidence for that belief, and that evidence for that belief rules out all these other beliefs that you have access to, that or all these other ideas that you have access to that you choose not to believe or don't believe because, well, you don't have evidence for them. You have evidence for this other belief. So you're not likely, when you have sufficient evidence, to believe something that's true, to then believe something else that's false. And so when we have knowledge, we have the justification, we have the support, the reason why, as Socrates calls it. And he calls the reason why, guess what? Recollection. So we have a true belief and we couple it with recollection, and that gets us knowledge. So his view seems to be something like knowledge is recollected true belief. Okay. That seems to be his view. So he's focusing like on this sort of the fundamentality, you might say, of memory and serving as justification for our true beliefs. So you know, why isn't true belief knowledge? Because true belief isn't essentially recollected. It can be recollected, but it doesn't have to be. It's when you have a sufficiently recollected true belief that you have knowledge on Socrates' view here in the Meno. Perhaps Plato's exploring a view here. So we get Socrates' theory of knowledge in the Meno. The slide's done. And now we're ready to talk about this last concluding point. So remember, like, we know that Socrates and Meno accept the claim that virtue isn't knowledge, so it's not teachable. But we're not innately virtuous. So it's not learned. It's not innate. So then how are people virtuous? How is Pericles virtuous? And here Socrates proposes the idea that, well, people can be virtuous by being bestowed virtue by the gods. So the gods have the gift of virtue as a gift to give us when we have it. And that's a possible explanation. So you might have thought that nature and nurture were the only options. There's also this other option, right? Being graced, you might say, being gifted virtue. So, um, you know, uh, we haven't exhausted all the options by talking about the innateness or the teachability of virtue in our attempt to explain how people are virtuous. The gods could bestow it, gift it to us. But keep in mind, we're not given here an answer to the Socratic question, what is virtue? Because we could easily run EDQ on it, couldn't we? So I don't think that Socrates is even trying to provide any insight into the essence of virtue on this score, because presumably Socrates knows what he argued in Euthyphro. Right? No insight into the essence of piety is given by saying that it's God loved. No essence into the insight of virtue is given by saying that it's God bestowed. The gods bestow it because it's virtuous, or is it virtuous because the gods bestow it? And now we're just, right, either way we answer EDQ, the Euthyphro dilemma question here, as it pertains to thinking about virtue and the gods bestowing it, no insight's given, because either we need to know what makes it virtuous in the first place, right? And that's why the gods bestow it, or anything can count as virtuous because the gods could bestow what? Anything. And now, if anything could be virtuous, then nothing's essentially virtuous. And well, we know the rest from there. So that's the conclusion of Plato's Meno. Having a little addendum here, but we won't cover that. So don't worry about that when you get the presentation on Canvas posted. So I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry, I got a little tickle in my throat. Stop sharing. Wish you all well. Thanks for watching, and reach out with any questions that you have. All right, have a good one. Bye.